The alien girl never expected a single human look to change everything HFY on the war-torn planet of Rylov. There was no place untouched by the violence of the ongoing conflict. The sky, once a beautiful shade of blue, now appeared dull and clouded, filled with the remnants of countless battles. Cities were reduced to rubble, and families lived in constant fear of the next attack. The human forces had invaded Rylov nearly 2 years ago, and since then, things had only gotten worse. Their advanced technology and military might overwhelmed the native population, forcing them to retreat into hidden corners of the planet. But not everyone felt hopeless. Not everyone accepted defeat. Nura was one of the last remaining survivors of her village. Her people, the Rylovians, were known for their resilience. Despite the relentless human occupation, they had fought back with everything they had. Yet the cost was high. Most of her friends, family, and even mentors were either dead or missing. The city she had once called home was now little more than a battlefield. It was under these circumstances that Nura had learned to survive, by blending into the shadows, keeping a low profile, and always thinking ahead. On this particular evening, Nura found herself in the heart of the human-occupied city of Dimer. She had heard whispers of a hidden supply cache in one of the abandoned buildings, and she had no choice but to risk going into enemy territory to retrieve what was left. Food and medicine were becoming scarce, and her family needed every resource they could find. She had always known the dangers of venturing too close to the human soldiers, but the necessity of the mission left no room for fear. The streets were eerily quiet as Nura moved through the alleys, the sound of distant explosions and gunfire muffled by the thick walls of the city. The air smelled of dust and metal, and the ground beneath her feet was cracked and uneven. Nura had become accustomed to this environment, the chaos that surrounded her, but tonight felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, as if something was about to change. Nura paused in the shadow of a ruined building, listening carefully. She could hear footsteps approaching, human soldiers on patrol. She pressed herself against the wall, holding her breath as they passed by. The soldiers moved with practiced precision, their weapons drawn and ready. Nura knew better than to cross their path. They would have no hesitation in killing her if they spotted her. As the soldiers moved out of sight, Nura continued on her way, her heart pounding in her chest. She was almost at the supply cache. She had to keep her composure, stay focused. But her mind kept drifting back to the soldiers she had just passed. She had encountered countless humans before, always with the same cold, indifferent expressions. They were soldiers, and she was the enemy. There was no room for empathy in this war. Yet something had been different about the soldier she had briefly locked eyes with earlier in the day. She couldn't explain it, but there had been something in his gaze that made her pause. Nura pushed the thought aside. She had a job to do, and she couldn't afford distractions. She reached the building where the cache was hidden. It was a crumbling structure, barely standing, with shattered windows and broken doors. The building had once been a thriving marketplace, but now it was a hollow shell of what it had been. Nura made her way inside, carefully stepping over the debris. Her fingers brushed against the wall, feeling the cool stone beneath her skin. She had been in many places like this before, places that had once been full of life, now reduced to nothing but ruins. The cache was located in a small storage room in the back of the building. Nura had memorized the map she'd found weeks ago. She was almost there when a sudden noise made her freeze. It was a sound she knew all too well, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind her. Someone was following her. Panic surged in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. She had to act fast. She quickly turned, ducking into a dark corner of the building, her pulse racing. From the darkness, she watched as a lone human soldier walked past, his eyes scanning the area. It was the same soldier she had seen earlier, the one whose gaze had unsettled her. He was tall, with short-cropped brown hair and piercing blue eyes. His uniform was standard issue, but there was something about the way he carried himself. He didn't look like the others. While the other soldiers seemed detached, robotic even, this one seemed different. His steps were slower, more deliberate, as if he was looking for something or someone. Nura held her breath, praying he wouldn't see her. She pressed herself further into the shadows, her heart hammering in her chest. The soldier paused, his gaze lingering for a moment on the spot where she had been standing. Nura could feel her heartbeat in her throat, every muscle in her body tense and ready to flee. But instead of moving closer, the soldier simply turned and continued his patrol, unaware of her presence. For a moment, Nura allowed herself to relax. The soldier was gone, and she was safe, for now. She waited for a few more seconds, then moved swiftly toward the storage room. Her mind was still racing, though. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The soldier, Lieutenant James Hartley, as she would later learn, hadn't seemed like the others. His eyes had softened when they met hers, a flicker of something she couldn't quite understand. Compassion, confusion. She wasn't sure, but it was a look that had never been directed at her by a human before. Nura shook her head, trying to push the thought aside. She was wasting time. She had to get the supplies and get out of the city. She had no place for emotions, especially not ones that made her question the very foundation of the war she was fighting. The war that had taken everything from her. She entered the storage room and quickly located the supplies she had come for: ration packs, medical supplies, and a few spare weapons. There wasn't much, but it would be enough to get her family through the next few weeks. Nura packed the items into a bag, slinging it over her shoulder. She was about to leave when a voice, soft but clear, broke through the silence. "Looking for something?" Nura froze. The voice was unmistakable. It was the soldier. She spun around to find him standing in the doorway, his weapon lowered but still in hand. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. Nura's heart raced, and she cursed at herself for not being more careful. She should have known he was close, should have anticipated that he might follow her. But it was too late now. She was caught, and she had no way out. The soldier didn't raise his weapon. Instead, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. "I've been looking for you," he said, his voice softer than she had expected. "You shouldn't be here." For a moment, Nura said nothing. She didn't know how to respond. She had always been taught that humans were enemies, that they were nothing more than conquerors, invaders. But this soldier, this human, didn't seem to fit that mold. His words weren't harsh or commanding. They were concerned. But why? Before she could form an answer, the soldier stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. There was a tension in the air, a moment of understanding passing between them, one that neither of them could explain. "Go," he said suddenly, his voice firm. "Get out of here, I won't stop you." Nura didn't move. She was frozen, caught in the strange moment between flight and fight. She could run. She could take her chances. But something told her that, for the first time in her life, running might not be the answer. For a moment, their eyes locked again, and everything seemed to change. The noise of the battle outside, the war that had torn their worlds apart, it all faded away. In that instant, it was just the two of them, standing in the ruins of a broken city, uncertain of what came next. The days that followed Nura's unexpected encounter with Lieutenant James hardly felt like a blur. The war was still raging outside the walls of the crumbling city, but inside her mind, a different battle was taking place. She couldn't stop thinking about the soldier. His face, his voice, and most importantly, his eyes, they stayed with her, lingering in her thoughts long after they had parted ways. Nura had always been taught to see humans as the enemy. They were invaders, conquerors who had no regard for the lives of her people. She had witnessed the destruction they left in their wake. Villages burned to the ground, families torn apart, cities reduced to ashes. She had been raised to fight back, to resist, and to never show weakness in the face of the human soldiers. And yet, when she had looked into James' eyes, something inside her had shifted. She had seen something in him that was different, something she didn't know how to reconcile with everything she had believed about the humans. Her family was still hiding in the underground shelters, and Nura was determined to do everything she could to protect them. But with each passing day, the pressure of living in constant fear was starting to weigh on her. The humans were tightening their grip on the planet. The resistance groups that had once stood strong were now crumbling, their numbers dwindling with every new assault. Nura had always been able to hold on to hope, but now, even that seemed to be slipping away. She spent her days moving through the streets of Dimer, gathering supplies for her family, always careful to avoid detection. But the city felt different now. It wasn't just the rubble and the scars left by the war. It was something deeper, something that had settled into her bones. She had never felt this conflicted before. The war had always been simple in her mind. Humans were the enemy and her people had to fight back. But now it was as if everything had become more complicated. The soldier's face haunted her thoughts. Every time she moved through the city, Every time she ducked into an alley or hid in the shadows, she wondered if he was somewhere nearby watching her. The idea was almost laughable. She had been in countless dangerous situations before, always aware of the enemy around her. But now, there was a new thought creeping into her mind. What if the enemy wasn't just the soldiers, but the war itself? What if the true enemy was the hatred that had driven both sides to destroy everything in their path? Despite these troubling thoughts, Nura knew she had to keep moving. Her family depended on her. The underground shelter where they had taken refuge was running out of supplies, and Nura couldn't afford to waste any more time. She had heard rumors of another human convoy moving into the outskirts of the city. It was the perfect opportunity to gather what they needed without drawing attention. She knew the risks, but the alternative was even worse. The streets were quieter than usual that day, and Nura felt the familiar tension building in her chest. Every step she took, every sound she heard, felt like it was amplified. She was hyper-aware of everything around her, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The human forces had increased patrols in the area recently, and Nura had to be careful not to draw attention. Her instincts screamed at her to hurry, to complete the mission and return home before it was too late. As she turned a corner, Nura froze. There, standing at the entrance of an alleyway, was Lieutenant Hartley. Her heart skipped a beat, and for a moment she thought her legs might give out beneath her. What was he doing here? She quickly glanced around, looking for an escape route, but the alley was a dead end. There was no way out. James didn't seem to notice her at first. He was standing still, his back to her, as if he was waiting for something or someone. But when Nura stepped forward, the sound of her footfalls echoed in the empty street. His head snapped up, and their eyes met. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nura's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know what to say, what to do. She had never expected to see him again, and now here he was, standing before her like some kind of strange omen. James was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "You're still here." Nura didn't respond immediately. Her mind was racing, trying to process everything. Why was he speaking to her? Why wasn't he attacking? She had expected him to raise his weapon, to demand her surrender, to treat her like the enemy. But instead, he seemed calm, almost relieved even. "I told you to leave the city," he continued, his tone softer than she had ever heard from a human soldier. "It's not safe here for either of us." Nura's mind snapped back to reality. She had to stay focused. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not now. She forced herself to speak, even though her voice felt shaky. "Why aren't you attacking me?" James looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Why would I? You're not the enemy, Nura." Nura stiffened. He knew her name. He knew who she was. That was something she hadn't expected. In the chaos of the war, no one ever cared to remember the names of their enemies. To the humans, she was just one more Rylovian to eliminate. But James had seen her as something more. Why? What was it that made her so different? She took a cautious step back. "What do you want from me, human?" "I don't want anything from you," James replied, his voice steady but earnest. I just want to make sure you're okay. I didn't want you to get hurt." Nura's head spun. She had no idea what he meant by that. Was this some kind of trick? A trap to lure her into a false sense of security? But when she looked into his eyes, she saw no malice, no hidden agenda, just confusion, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice firmer now. "I don't need your help." James didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the empty street as if searching for something. "You should be afraid," he said quietly. "This city isn't safe for anyone anymore. The human forces are tightening their grip. If they find you, they won't hesitate to kill you." Nura's heart skipped a beat. The way he said it, with such quiet certainty, made her realize just how much danger she was in. She had always known the humans were ruthless, but hearing it from one of their own felt different. She had never heard a human speak with such regret. "I'm not afraid of them," Nura replied, her voice more defiant now. "I've survived worse than this." James seemed to hesitate, his eyes flicking between her and the street ahead. "I know you're strong, but strength won't be enough when they come for you. Please, just listen to me. Get out of the city while you can." Nura felt a surge of frustration. Why was he telling her this? Why was he so concerned about her well-being? He was a human soldier, part of the force that had invaded her world and destroyed everything she knew. And yet, here he was, warning her, trying to help her. "I don't need your pity," she said, her voice sharp. I don't need your help and I don't need your sympathy. James flinched, as though her words had struck him harder than she had intended. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. Finally, James spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I'm not pitying you, Nura. I'm trying to warn you. You don't have to fight this war alone. Nura didn't know what to say. Her emotions were a tangled mess inside her. Part of her wanted to believe him, to trust him, but the other part of her, the part that had survived this war, warned her to never trust a human soldier. They were the enemy. They had to be. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed from down the street. Both Nura and James tensed, instantly alert. The sound of approaching footsteps rang out from around the corner, followed by the sharp voices of human soldiers. It was clear that they were closing in on their position. James quickly grabbed Nura's arm, pulling her toward the nearest alley. Come on, we need to move, now! Nura didn't hesitate. The sound of human soldiers searching for her was enough to spur her into action. She followed James as he led her through the narrow alleyways, his grip firm but not forceful. She had no choice but to trust him for now. There was no time to question his motives. The war was still happening, and they were both caught in its grip. As they ran, Nura's thoughts raced. What was happening? Why had he warned her? Why did it feel like the world was shifting beneath her feet? But there were no answers. Only the sound of running footsteps, the pounding of her heart, and the knowledge that, for the first time, she wasn't sure who the real enemy was anymore. Nura's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her legs burning with each step. The alleyways of Dimer blurred around her, the dim light casting long shadows against the walls. James' grip on her arm was firm, guiding her through the maze of streets with a sense of urgency that was becoming all too real. The sound of soldiers searching for them echoed in the distance, their voices sharp and demanding, growing closer with each passing moment. Nura didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. She could only focus on putting one foot in front of the other, her heart racing as she followed James through the narrow passageways. She had never imagined she would be running through the streets of Dimer with a human soldier, not like this. The very thought of it felt wrong, unnatural. But something in James' actions, in the way he had spoken to her, made her question everything she had believed. Was he really just like the others, or was there something different about him? They turned another corner, and Nura found herself in an even darker alley, far from the main street. The buildings here were older, their windows shattered, their walls cracked and crumbling from years of neglect. James led her to a small doorway, hidden behind a pile of debris. Without a word, he pushed the door open and ushered her inside. The room was small, barely enough space for both of them to stand. A single, flickering light bulb hung from the ceiling, casting weak shadows across the floor. The walls were bare, save for a few pieces of furniture that looked as though they had been scavenged from the wreckage of other buildings. It wasn't much, but it was shelter, and that was all they needed for now. James closed the door behind them, the sound of it locking softly in the stillness. He didn't say anything at first, but Nura could feel his eyes on her, as though he were waiting for her to speak. She glanced around the room, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here for long. The soldiers would be searching for them, and they needed to keep moving. But despite the urgency in her mind, there was something else, something she hadn't expected. A sense of calm washed over her as she looked at James. He had saved her from capture. He had risked his own safety to get her out of that alley to help her escape the soldiers. Why? What was it that made him different from all the other human soldiers she had encountered? She tried to shake off the thought. This was a dangerous game she was playing. She couldn't afford to trust him. She couldn't afford to trust any of them. Why are you helping me? Nura's voice broke the silence, the question hanging in the air between them. James hesitated for a moment, his eyes not leaving hers. He looked conflicted, as if he were struggling to find the right words. I don't know, he finally said, his voice soft but firm. I've seen enough of the destruction, the death. I can't be part of it anymore, not the way they want me to be. I don't want to keep fighting a war that has no end. Nura stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. His words were unexpected, far more vulnerable than she had imagined a human soldier might be. She had always thought of them as machines, cold, unfeeling, programmed only to follow orders. But James, he was different. She could see it in the way he spoke, in the way he had helped her. There was something human in him, something she had never expected to find. But even as her mind processed this, another part of her was screaming to stay cautious. This could be a trap. He could be playing her, luring her into a false sense of security before turning her over to his superiors. "Why would you do this?" Nura asked, her voice steady but filled with doubt. "You're a human soldier. You're supposed to be my enemy." James nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I know, but I can't see you as the enemy anymore. Not after everything I've seen." He took a step closer, his voice lowering. "I don't want to fight anymore, not like this. I want it to end. I want to help you." For a moment, Nura said nothing. The silence between them felt heavy, charged with something she couldn't quite define. She was caught between the instinct to trust her own judgment and the unsettling feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was something in James' words that was true. Something that could change everything. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly, almost to herself. "How do I know this isn't some trick?" James sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped hair. "I can't prove it to you, I can only show you. I'm not asking you to trust me right away, but I want to help. I want to do the right thing." Nura's mind raced as she processed his words. She wanted to believe him, to believe that there was still something good in the humans, something worth fighting for. But she had seen too much, had lost too much to let her guard down so easily. Her family was depending on her. She couldn't risk everything on the hope that James was telling the truth. "I can't stay here," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "The soldiers will find us. We have to keep moving." James looked at her, his expression softening. "I know, but we can't just run forever, Nura. There's a way to end this. There's a way to stop the fighting." Nura shook her head. "How? The humans won't listen. They've already taken everything from us." "What can we do?" James stepped closer, his eyes locking with hers. "We can show them that it's possible to stop this, that we can live in peace even after everything that's happened. It's not too late." Nura felt a lump rise in her throat as she looked at him. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that peace was possible. But the war had taken so much from her. Her friends, her family, her entire world had been torn apart by the human forces. How could she trust that things could change now? How could she believe that James, the same kind of soldier who had helped destroy her planet, could be the one to bring about that change? But she also knew she couldn't keep running forever. The war was relentless, and as long as it continued, her people would never know peace. She had to do something. But what? Could she really work with James to end the war? Was it even possible? The sound of footsteps outside the door broke her out of her thoughts. James immediately moved to the window, peering out through a small crack in the broken glass. His face hardened as he looked back at Nura. "They're getting closer," he whispered. "We don't have much time." Nura nodded, her heart pounding. "We need to go. We can't let them find us here." Without another word, they moved quickly, making their way toward the back of the room where a small door led to an alley. James paused, glancing at Nura one last time. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here to help." Nura looked at him, her mind still uncertain, but a small spark of hope flickered in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to end this war. Together, they stepped into the alley, their footsteps blending into the night. The sounds of the city, the distant explosions, the hum of the human machines, faded into the background as they made their way toward an uncertain future. One thing was clear. Their journey was just beginning, and the path ahead would not be easy. But as long as they fought together, Nura had to believe that it was a fight worth taking on. The night air was thick with tension as Nura and James made their way through the dark streets of Dimer. The sound of distant explosions, the crackle of gunfire, and the whir of military vehicles all felt like a constant reminder of the war that was engulfing their world. But tonight, as they moved through the alleys and shadows, those sounds felt distant. They were just two people trying to survive in a city that had long since lost its humanity. Nura's heart was heavy. The events of the past few days, her unexpected meeting with James, his strange offer of help, the escape from the soldiers, had turned her world upside down. She had always believed that humans were her enemies, that they were the ones who had come to destroy everything she held dear. But James, he was different. She had seen something in his eyes when he spoke to her, something that made her question everything she had ever known. The question still burned in her mind. Why was he helping her? He was a human soldier, after all, the enemy, and yet he had risked his life to save her, to help her escape. He had looked at her not with the cold indifference of a soldier, but with something softer, something that resembled understanding. They continued moving through the streets, avoiding the main roads where patrols were heavy. James led the way, his steps sure and steady. as if he had been through this kind of thing before. Nura, on the other hand, was still adjusting to the reality of working alongside a human soldier, especially one who seemed to care about her survival. The whole situation felt like a dream, one that she couldn't quite wake up from. "You okay?" James asked, his voice breaking through the silence. Nura nodded, but she didn't trust her voice enough to speak. She had so many questions, but none of them seemed to matter right now. All she could think about was getting to safety. Her family was still out there, and they needed her. She couldn't afford to let this distraction, whatever it was, get in the way of her mission. They reached a small, crumbling building on the edge of the city. The building had been abandoned long before the war had reached Dimer, and now it seemed like the perfect place to hide. James pushed open the door, leading them into a dimly lit hallway. The walls were bare, save for a few scraps of paper and old furniture strewn across the floor. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. Once inside, they took a moment to catch their breath. James moved to a small table in the corner, rummaging through a bag he had been carrying. Nura leaned against the wall, her eyes scanning the room. The tension in her chest hadn't eased. It felt like the calm before a storm, and she knew that storm was coming. James finally turned to her, holding out a small packet of food. "Here," he said. "It's not much, but it should help." Nura took the packet without hesitation. Her stomach growled in protest, reminding her how long it had been since she'd had a proper meal. She opened the packet and ate quickly, her eyes never leaving James. She needed to understand. She needed to know why he was doing this. "You keep saying you want to help me," Nura said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I don't understand why. Why would you risk everything for someone like me?" James sat down across from her, his expression somber. He ran a hand through his hair, looking exhausted. "I don't really know," he admitted. "I don't have a good answer for that. All I know is that I can't keep doing what I've been doing. I've seen too much destruction, too many people dying for no reason. And when I saw you that day, I couldn't just ignore it. I had to do something." Nura listened carefully, her mind racing. She had never heard a human soldier speak like this before. Most of them didn't care about the people they were fighting against. They were trained to follow orders, to kill without hesitation. But James wasn't like that. There was a kind of sadness in his eyes, a weariness that spoke of battles fought and lost, of ideals that had been shattered in the face of war. "I didn't want to be a part of this war," he continued, "but I didn't have a choice. When I first enlisted, I thought I was doing something good, something that mattered, but after all this time, it just doesn't make sense anymore. I've seen too much bloodshed, too many lives lost. And when I saw you, when I saw someone like you fighting to survive, fighting for your family, it made me question everything." Nura felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. She had never expected this. She had always thought that the humans, the soldiers, were just heartless machines, driven only by their orders. But James was different. He had seen the destruction his people had caused, and he was haunted by it. He wasn't just following orders, he was struggling with the consequences of those orders. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I'm asking a lot from you. You don't have to trust me. But if there's any chance we can stop this war, if there's any chance we can end the fighting, I need your help." Nura sat in silence for a moment, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. She had never trusted a human before. How could she? They were the ones who had taken everything from her people. But James wasn't like the others. He wasn't asking for her to forget the past or forgive the things his people had done. He was asking for a chance to make things right. And that was something she hadn't expected to hear. "I don't know if I can help you," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't do this alone. My family, they need me. I have to keep them safe." James nodded. "I understand, and I'll help you do that. We can't undo the past, but we can stop the war from continuing. Together." Nura met his gaze, the weight of his words settling in her chest. Could she really work with him? Could she really trust him to help her bring an end to the war? The thought of working with a human soldier, someone who had once been her enemy, seemed impossible. But then again, wasn't everything about this war impossible? The sound of footsteps outside the building snapped her back to the present. James stood up immediately, his hand reaching for the gun at his side. Nura's heart raced as she listened intently. The soldiers were close, too close. "We need to move," James said urgently, his eyes scanning the room for an escape route. "Now." Nura nodded quickly, her thoughts focused on survival. She had no time for doubts, no time for questions. They had to get out, and they had to do it fast. James led the way, and Nura followed closely behind, her footsteps silent on the cracked floor. They made their way to the back of the building, where a narrow passage led to an alley. James checked the street before stepping out, his eyes scanning for any signs of movement. The coast seemed clear. "We've got a safe house on the other side of the city," James said quietly. "We can lay low there until we figure out our next move." Nura nodded, her mind still racing. A safe house. It sounded like a dream, a place where they could hide away from the chaos of the war. But the reality was different. There were no safe places in a war zone, not anymore. But as they moved through the dark streets, dodging patrols and avoiding the watchful eyes of the soldiers, Nura couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. It was a small spark, but it was enough to remind her that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this. A way to stop the fighting, to stop the endless cycle of destruction. As they moved deeper into the city, the world around them seemed to disappear. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nura wasn't thinking about the war. She wasn't thinking about the soldiers, the violence, or the destruction. She was thinking about something else, a future where the fighting could end, where families could be reunited, and where the planet could heal. It seemed impossible. But as long as they were together, Nura knew that it was a fight worth taking on. The hours that followed were a blur of movement. Nura and James slipped through the streets of Dimer like shadows, moving from one hiding place to another, always on alert. The soldiers were everywhere, their patrols sweeping the city in search of anyone who didn't belong. They had learned the hard way that even the smallest mistake could get them caught. Every time Nura and James ducked into an alley or hid behind a wall, they were aware of the risks. But they didn't stop moving. They couldn't. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of the city, where the towering buildings gave way to empty fields and abandoned factories. The air was cleaner here, less choked by the smoke and dust of the constant bombardment. It was quiet, too, except for the occasional distant hum of military vehicles. James led Nura toward an old, run-down building on the edge of a small industrial complex. It looked like it had been forgotten, its windows boarded up and its door barely hanging on its hinges. "This is it," James said, his voice low. He pushed open the door with ease, and they stepped inside. The building was dark and musty, but it was safer than the streets of Dimer. The interior was sparsely furnished, with only a few tables, chairs, and old equipment scattered around. It was clear that the place had been used by someone before, but it hadn't been occupied for long. James led Nura to a small room in the back where a single cot sat against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. "We'll rest here for a while," James said, closing the door behind them. "We'll need to keep moving soon, but this is a good place to lay low." Nura nodded, her mind still racing. She had never imagined she would find herself in a safe house, hiding out with a human soldier. But here they were, trying to survive in a world that had turned against them both. She sat down on the cot, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to process everything that had happened. James sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "I know this isn't what you expected," he said after a moment. "I never thought I'd be here either. But we have a chance to do something together." Nura glanced up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean? What exactly are we trying to do?" James took a deep breath, his gaze steady. "We can end this war, we don't have to keep fighting. If we can get the right people to listen, if we can show them that there's another way, that we don't have to keep destroying each other, maybe we can make a difference." Nura frowned, unsure whether to believe him. She had seen the devastation caused by the human forces, felt the weight of the destruction on her own shoulders. Her people had been fighting for so long, and she couldn't shake the feeling that peace was impossible. The humans had taken so much from her world. "How could anything change now? You're asking me to believe that a war that has lasted for years can just end because you and I show up and ask for it too?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. James didn't flinch at her harsh words. He met her gaze with the same calm resolve that had guided him through everything. "I know it sounds impossible, but the longer this war drags on, the worse it gets. If we don't try, if we don't fight for peace now, it will never come. We've seen the destruction. It's up to us to stop it." Nura was quiet for a long time, her mind weighed down by the magnitude of what James was asking. She wanted to believe in the possibility of peace, wanted to believe that there was more to this war than the endless fighting and death. But it was hard. She had lost so much. The memories of her village, her family, and her friends were still too fresh, too painful. How could she let go of the anger, the hatred she had carried for so long? "You've seen the destruction too," she said softly. "You've seen what your people have done. How can you just walk away from that?" James looked down at his hands, his fingers tightening into fists before he relaxed them. "I can't undo the past. None of us can, but I don't want to keep being part of the destruction. I want to be part of the solution. I want to make things right." Nura could see the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was something more to him than just a soldier. She had always thought of humans as invaders, as enemies. But James had seen the same horrors she had. He wasn't a faceless soldier. He was a person struggling just like she was. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions that churned inside her. "I don't know if I can do this," she said quietly. "I don't know if I can trust that things can change." James leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I know it's hard. I know you've lost everything, but we can't change the past. All we can do is move forward. And we can't do it alone. If we're going to stop the fighting, we need to work together." Nura closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about the future, about what could be. The path ahead was uncertain, but she knew she couldn't stay in hiding forever. She had to do something. The war had taken so much from her, from all of them. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance to change things. "What do we do now?" she asked, opening her eyes and meeting James' gaze. James stood up and moved to the door, checking the street outside once more. "We need to find the others. The people who want to end this war, the ones who have the power to make it stop. We need to unite the resistance. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." Nura stood up as well, her body stiff with uncertainty. She didn't know how they would convince anyone to listen to them. After everything that had happened, after all the destruction, how could anyone believe that peace was possible? But James was right. If they didn't try, if they didn't take that first step, then nothing would ever change. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady now. "I'll help you. I'll do whatever it takes." James smiled, a small but genuine smile that made Nura's heart flutter slightly. "Thank you." They both knew that the road ahead would be difficult, filled with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time in a long while, Nura felt a glimmer of hope. They had a chance. A real chance to stop the war, to stop the destruction. And that chance began now. They left the safe house quietly, moving through the dark streets once more. The world was still a dangerous place, but as they walked side by side, Nura felt a sense of unity with James. It was strange, unexpected. She had never imagined that the human she had once seen as the enemy would become someone she could rely on. They didn't have all the answers, and the path ahead would be long and uncertain, but they had something now. A purpose. A reason to fight for a future that didn't involve endless violence. And in that moment, Nura knew that even in the darkest times, there was always a chance for light. Together, they would change the future.